Hello, and welcome to another lesson in harmony, this time secondary diminished, part 2. Before we go on to the other type of secondary diminished 7th chord, I just want to say there's a type of resolution I forgot to mention in the last video, and that is if you have a diminished chord, a secondary diminished, let's use the example of G sharp diminished in the key of C, so G sharp B D, you can resolve it down a third to a dominant. So that would be going down to E dominant, or 5 of 6, E, G sharp, B, D. This works because we can go from a B diminished chord to a G dominant chord because most of the notes are already there. You already have G sharp, B, and D. You're just adding a new root, your ear adjusts to a new tonal center and goes, okay, new chord. Now, the other type of secondary diminished 7th chord is the fully diminished 7, and this is just stacked minor thirds. So that means there's actually only 3 of them. You can have one built on C, C, E flat, F sharp, A, on C sharp, E, G, B flat, or on D, D, F, A flat, B. I used some enharmonic spellings there, and here's why. If you build this chord on an E flat instead of on C, you would have E flat, F sharp, A, C, because it's just minor thirds on top of minor thirds. This is what's known as a symmetric chord, because it's the same, no matter what. Now, it can resolve all of the ways a half diminished chord can. It can also resolve as what is called a common tone diminished. Now, what that means is that it shares a note, usually the root, but not always, with whatever chord it is that it resolves to. And we have a few different ways we can resolve a common tone diminished. Now, the first is either diatonically on the 2nd scale degree or on the 5th scale degree. And in either case, it eventually ends up going to the dominant. So I'll use the longer example first. If you're on, let's say, a D fully diminished chord, we're in the key of C, you resolve it to a 2. A D minor 7, D, F, A, C. You go from there to the dominant, which would be G7, G, B, D, F, and then resolve that however you want to resolve your 5th. You can also just skip going to the 2 and just have a fully diminished chord on G, G, B flat, D flat, E. You resolve that to G7, and then resolve that as you will. That's probably the most common usage of it, especially diatonically, but you can also resolve it to just a major chord. This makes it something that comes up more often on F or on C, but you can therefore also use it in some other ways, which we'll talk about now, which is you can resolve it to a secondary dominant. So if you have one built on E, E, G, B flat, D flat, you can just resolve that to a 5 of 6, which would be an E dominant chord, then go to A, and you get it from there. And what you can also do with that is you can resolve it to a minor 7 and then go to a dominant. So using the same E diminished chord, we can resolve that to an E7, go to a dominant, and then resolve that however you want to resolve your secondary dominant. And the only other way that commonly comes up with it is going to a half diminished chord. So, and that's specifically when you're on the 2. So you go from a fully diminished D chord, D, F, A flat, B. You resolve that to C diminished, and then you treat it like a half diminished chord. You can also do that with other secondary diminished, but it's once again more common on the 2. But it's actually a really versatile chord if you go for it in slightly less traditional ways, because it works well with something called modulation, which is essentially changing keys. We'll get into that more a bit later, because it is symmetrical, because having one in E flat is the same as having one on C, and it's somewhat of an ambiguous chord in that sense, and therefore very useful, very common among late Romantic composers, but like I said, we'll deal with modulations and key changes later, but keep that in the back of your mind. Maybe experiment with it a little bit if you want to. And yeah, that's really it about secondary diminished chords. Hope you enjoyed this lesson and hope you come back soon. All right, bye-bye.